August 26th, a muddy field in northern France. 9,000 tired English soldiers stand facing more than 30,000 of Europe's most powerful knights. The French army is full of princes, dukes, and kings. Their cavalry is heavy, their armor shines, and their confidence is absolute. By sunset, that confidence will be buried in the mud with them. The cream of French nobility will lie broken, not cut down by other noble warriors, but by peasants holding longbows. 500 years of knightly dominance will not end in a grand campaign or a glorious duel. It will end in one night, under a storm of English arrows. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a simple wooden bow, costing only a few pennies, destroyed armor worth a fortune. You'll see why the most elite knights in Europe ended up trampling their own men in blind panic, and you'll discover how one king's suicidal charge became the last breath of medieval chivalry. This is the night English archers ended the age of knights forever. Edward III's campaign in France had been brutal. He landed in Normandy with around 15,000 men, claiming the French throne through his mother, and immediately began a devastating raid known as a chevauchée. His army burned villages, looted towns, destroyed crops, and spread fear across northern France. It wasn't a noble war. It was controlled destruction meant to prove that the French king couldn't protect his own people. Everywhere the English moved, panic followed. Meanwhile, the French prepared the largest army in Christendom. More than 30,000 men gathered, including 12,000 armored cavalry. These weren't just soldiers. This was the medieval version of the Avengers. Dukes, counts, princes, and kings from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia arrived with his court, and nobles from distant regions came eager for glory. For centuries, heavy cavalry had ruled European battlefields. A fully armored knight on an armored horse weighed about a ton. Raised for war from childhood, these men trained with weapons their entire lives. Their armor cost more than a village could earn in years. Battles were decided by cavalry charges, and infantry existed mostly to be crushed under hooves. To be a knight meant to be untouchable. But Edward had something the French didn't respect: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These weren't nobles. Many were peasants and criminals. But English law forced every man to practice archery every Sunday after church. It was literally illegal to skip training. Over years, their bodies shaped themselves to the bow. Their left arms grew longer, their backs grew stronger, and they learned to shoot fast and hard. A trained longbowman could fire 12 arrows a minute, each one hitting a target at over 200 yards. Their bows were simple pieces of yew wood, but in skilled hands they were devastating. Edward positioned his army carefully. He chose a hill near Crécy and arranged his forces in 3 divisions. The archers stood in a V shape between the lines, creating deadly overlapping fields of fire. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot, a shocking move at the time. Stakes were hammered into the ground, ditches were dug, and traps were set to break cavalry charges. The battlefield became a carefully prepared killing ground. While the French gathered their nobles like a parade, the English built a trap. Edward wasn't just fighting for survival. He was about to change the rules of war forever. The night before the battle showed 2 completely different worlds. In the English camp, everything was quiet and focused. Archers carefully rubbed beeswax into their bowstrings to keep them dry. Stakes were hammered deep into the earth, and ditches were dug by torchlight. Edward made sure his men were fed well, handing out meat and ale so they could rest with full stomachs. There was no shouting, no panic, no confusion. Every man knew his place, and the preparations turned the muddy hill into a fortress. Across the field, the French camp was loud and chaotic. Nobles rode past each other in glittering armor, their banners snapping in the wind like they were at a tournament. Trumpets blared, horses neighed, and proud voices filled the night air. Dukes and counts openly argued about who would lead the charge, who would capture Edward for ransom, and who would have the most glory. Philip VI tried to bring order, but his commands were drowned out by nobles competing to be heard. It looked more like a show of vanity than a disciplined army preparing for war. Then a sudden rainstorm swept over the field. For the English, it wasn't a problem. Their archers calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their helmets and cloaks, keeping them dry. On the French side, the Genoese crossbowmen were not so prepared. Their crossbow strings stretched and sagged, losing their power. A small detail, but it would decide the fate of thousands. By the next afternoon, the contrast was complete. Edward's army stood ready, lines tight, archers prepared. Philip ordered the French to wait until the next day to attack, but pride took control. Behind him, nobles shouted that glory was slipping away. Some were already lowering their lances. One by one, they surged forward, ignoring their king. What began as a royal army turned into a mob driven by arrogance. The battle would not begin with strategy. It would begin with pride running wild. The opening phase of the battle began with the Genoese crossbowmen. These were professional mercenaries, hired by the French to soften the English lines before the noble cavalry charge. Around 5,000 of them moved to the front, carrying their crossbows into the muddy field. Normally, they would have carried large wooden shields called pavises to hide behind while reloading. But that day, their pavises were still stuck with the baggage train far behind the army. They had to advance without any cover, stepping into open ground in front of thousands of English archers. The earlier rain had made everything worse. While the English had carefully unstrung their bows to keep their strings dry, the Genoese had done nothing. Their crossbow strings were soaked and stretched. A dry crossbow could shoot far, but a wet one lost its power. The Genoese lined up, raised their weapons, and fired the first volley at about 150 yards. Most of the bolts fell short, clattering harmlessly into the mud. The French nobles waiting behind expected a storm of deadly bolts. Instead, they saw a weak, scattered shot that did nothing to the English lines. Then came the English reply. 5,000 longbowmen drew their bows in unison. Each man could fire 12 arrows a minute. That's 60,000 arrows every 60 seconds. Witnesses said the sound of the arrows leaving the bows was like thunder rolling across the hills. The sky literally darkened as a storm of arrows fell on the Genoese. Their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload, while the longbows fired every 5. In the time it took one Genoese to prepare his next shot, he was already being hit by a dozen arrows. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and nowhere to run. Arrows smashed into their armor, pierced gaps, tore through faces and throats. Horses screamed, men collapsed. In moments, panic spread through the mercenary ranks. They broke formation and began to run back toward the French lines, desperate to escape the hail of arrows. What happened next was shocking even by medieval standards. The French nobles, furious that their expensive mercenaries were retreating, shouted in rage. The Count d'Alençon reportedly yelled, "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way!" Without hesitation, armored knights charged forward, cutting down the fleeing Genoese. Horses trampled them, swords slashed at their backs, and the same nobles who had hired them turned on them in fury. The Genoese were caught between English arrows and French blades. Those who didn't die under the rain of arrows were cut apart by the very men who paid their wages. The field became a nightmare. English archers continued to fire volley after volley, cutting down anyone who stayed in range. The Genoese tried to flee in every direction, but the French cavalry was pressing forward behind them. There was no room to escape. Bodies piled up in the mud, blocking the way forward. Those few mercenaries who survived fled entirely, throwing down their crossbows and cursing their employers. The opening phase ended with thousands of mercenaries dead or fleeing. The English hadn't even moved their lines. They simply stood and unleashed storm after storm of arrows. The French plan to weaken the English before the cavalry charge had completely failed. And worse, their own army had murdered its front line in a fit of pride and frustration. The slaughter of the Genoese was only the beginning. The French nobility still believed their armored charge would crush the English. They had no idea what was waiting for them next. The battle truly began when the Genoese crossbowmen were pushed to the front. These men were professional mercenaries, famous across Europe for their skill with the crossbow. About 5,000 of them advanced toward the English line. Normally, their job was simple: walk forward under the protection of their heavy pavises, unleash a deadly volley, reload behind cover, and repeat. But on this day, everything went wrong. Their pavises, large wooden shields used to protect them during reloading, were stuck far behind with the baggage train. They had no cover, no protection, and no way to defend themselves in the open. The earlier rain made things even worse. The English longbowmen had calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their cloaks to keep them dry. The Genoese had not. Their crossbow strings were soaked and stretched. A crossbow depended on strong tension to fire effectively. When wet, the strings lost their snap, turning a deadly weapon into a weak toy. Even the best mercenary couldn't fix that in the middle of a battlefield. The Genoese lined up about 150 yards from the English. They raised their wet crossbows and fired the first volley. Instead of a deadly storm, their bolts fell short, splashing harmlessly into the mud. What should have been a terrifying opening attack became an embarrassment. The French nobles watching from behind grew restless and angry. This was supposed to be the moment the English lines weakened. Instead, nothing happened. Then came the English answer. 5,000 longbowmen raised their bows. Each archer could fire 12 arrows a minute. That's 60,000 arrows flying every 60 seconds. The sound of thousands of bowstrings releasing at once rolled across the field like thunder. Witnesses said the sky literally darkened as a wave of arrows shot upward before plunging down on the Genoese. The difference in reload time was devastating. A Genoese crossbowman needed 30 seconds to prepare his next shot, but in that same time, 6 volleys of arrows were already coming at him. Arrows tore through the Genoese ranks. With no pavises, they were completely exposed. The first wave of arrows struck shields, armor, faces, legs, and horses. Screams filled the air as men fell. The second wave struck before the survivors could react. It was relentless. The Genoese could not match the English rate of fire. Every step they took forward was answered by a storm of arrows. Their formation collapsed under the pressure. Panic spread quickly. Mercenaries began to throw down their weapons and run. Thousands turned and fled toward their own lines, desperate to escape the deadly rain. But the French nobles waiting behind saw retreat, not desperation. They were furious. The Count d'Alençon, one of the leading nobles, shouted in rage, "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way." And that's exactly what happened. Armored knights spurred their horses forward, charging into their own mercenaries. They cut them down without hesitation. Swords slashed at the backs of fleeing Genoese. Hooves crushed men into the mud. The same nobles who had paid for these crossbowmen turned on them in anger, turning retreat into slaughter. The Genoese were trapped between English arrows and French steel. Those who weren't killed by the hail of arrows were hacked down by the men behind them. The scene was pure chaos. The field became clogged with bodies, broken weapons, and dying men. The English archers didn't need to move an inch. They just kept firing. Volley after volley slammed into the retreating mass. Some mercenaries tried to flee to the sides, but there was nowhere to go. The French cavalry was pressing forward, and the English line loomed ahead. It was a trap with no escape. Within minutes, the opening phase ended in disaster for the French. The Genoese front line was broken, scattered, or dead. Thousands of mercenaries had been wiped out without the English taking a single step forward. The French plan to weaken the English before the cavalry charge had failed completely. Worse, they had slaughtered their own men in full view of both armies. It was a brutal start that showed exactly what kind of battle this would be: fast, unforgiving, and merciless. The English archers stood ready. The French nobles, blinded by pride, still believed their charge would succeed. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. With the Genoese wiped out, the French nobles believed it was finally their turn to shine. They had spent their lives training for this moment. Thousands of armored knights gathered at the base of the hill, tightening their formations, lowering their lances, and preparing for the thunderous charge they believed would crush the English line. Behind them, banners snapped in the wind, and trumpets called for the attack. It was the sight that had decided countless medieval battles. Heavily armored cavalry, charging in waves, had been unbeatable for centuries. But this day would be different. The French cavalry surged forward through the mud. 12,000 mounted knights began to climb the hill toward the English positions. Each knight sat atop a massive war horse, itself often armored, weighing over 1,000 pounds. Together, horse and rider formed a living tank. Normally, once they reached full speed, nothing could stop them. Infantry lines would shatter. Archers would scatter. But the English were ready. As the French knights charged uphill, the first thing they met was not the English line, but the traps Edward's men had built the night before. Hidden ditches and holes lay just beneath the surface of the muddy ground. Sharpened stakes angled toward the enemy were hammered into the earth in front of the archers. War horses galloping uphill didn't see them until it was too late. Legs snapped, horses crashed, riders were thrown into the mud. The momentum of the charge began to break before it even reached the English. Then came the arrows. 5,000 longbowmen unleashed volley after volley into the charging mass. Arrows rained down like a storm. At long range, bodkin-tipped arrows didn't always pierce solid plate armor, but they didn't have to. Horses had weak points, the eyes, necks, and joints, and the English knew exactly where to aim. A horse hit by several arrows screamed, stumbled, and collapsed, turning into a 1,500-pound obstacle that the next wave of cavalry slammed into. Riders crashed into each other, shattering formations. At closer range, the arrows became deadly even to knights. Bodkin points were designed to punch through mail and into the weak spots of plate armor. Arrows slammed through visors into faces, pierced armpits, slid through gaps at the joints, and buried themselves in thighs. Even when the arrows didn't pierce, the impact was brutal. Imagine being hit repeatedly with a hammer while trapped inside a steel shell. Knights were rattling inside their armor like dice in a cup. The first wave faltered under the relentless fire. Horses went down in heaps, blocking the path. Knights tried to climb over the bodies only to be struck mid-step by another hail of arrows. The muddy slope turned into a slaughterhouse. But the French response wasn't to retreat, it was to send more. Wave after wave of cavalry followed, each crashing into the wreckage of the previous one. 16 separate cavalry charges were launched that day, each one breaking against the English defenses like waves against a cliff. The English archers had prepared piles of arrows stuck upright in the ground in front of them for quick access, but even they fired so many volleys that their supply ran out at times. When that happened, they didn't stop. Archers ran forward into the chaos, pulling arrows from the bodies of dead and dying knights, and fired them back into the oncoming waves. The French knights were literally being killed by their own recycled suffering. Mud sucked at their feet, stakes impaled horses, ditches broke lines, arrows hammered down from above. It was chaos. Knights who dismounted found themselves stuck in 60 pounds of armor, unable to move quickly. They became easy targets for archers and infantry. Once the momentum of a cavalry charge was gone, their power disappeared with it. The English line held firm. By the time the 16th charge broke apart, the field was choked with bodies, horses, knights, broken weapons, and shattered pride. What had once been the pride of European nobility had turned into a tangled, bloody mess. The cavalry, once the unstoppable force of medieval warfare, had been stopped cold by a wall of arrows, mud, and preparation. The French had thrown everything they had at the hill. The English hadn't moved an inch. In the middle of the chaos, when the French cavalry charges had failed again and again, a single figure stood out, a man who could not see the battlefield at all. This was John of Bohemia, the blind king. He had been blind for 10 years, but that did not stop him from riding into war. John was a seasoned warrior, a noble who had fought in campaigns across Europe. He had come to this battle not because he expected victory, but because he refused to stay behind while others sought glory. As the French lines began to crumble, John asked what was happening. His attendants told him the battle was going badly. The English archers were tearing through the French ranks, and the cavalry charges were collapsing in the mud. He listened carefully and then gave his famous response. The King of Bohemia does not flee from a battle. Even without his sight, he wanted to strike one blow for honor. He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so they would ride together into the fight. They tied themselves in a line, with John in the center. He could not see the enemy, but he could hear the clash of weapons, the screams of horses, and the sound of arrows cutting through the air. His goal was simple and tragic. He wanted to charge into the English lines, swing his sword at least once, and die fighting like a king. The small group began their charge. Unlike the earlier cavalry waves, theirs was not a rush of hundreds. It was a slow, determined push into a storm of arrows. English archers saw them coming, a handful of riders linked together, and unleashed volleys. Arrows struck their horses, their armor, their bodies. But John and his knights did not stop. They rode straight into the English line, guided only by the sounds of battle. When they reached the front, John lifted his sword and swung at the air, striking at shadows he could not see. The English surrounded them. Arrows, blades, and spears met their charge. One by one, John and his knights were cut down. When the fighting ended, the English soldiers found their bodies tied together by the reins, their horses fallen in a heap. John was still holding his sword. His blind eyes were open, and he had died exactly as he wished, in battle, with his blade raised. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, witnessed this act of courage. He was deeply moved by John's final charge. As a tribute, he took John's personal emblem, 3 white ostrich feathers with the motto, Ich dien, meaning, I serve. That emblem became the symbol of the Prince of Wales and is still used today. John of Bohemia's last charge became one of the most legendary moments of the battle. It was a scene of pure chivalry in a war that was otherwise defined by mud, arrows, and brutal efficiency. His death was both noble and tragic, a reminder of the old ideals of knighthood. While the French army broke apart around him, John's final act stood as the last glowing ember of a dying age. It was the last charge of a true knight, blind but unyielding, facing certain death for the sake of honor. As the sun began to sink behind the muddy fields of Crécy, the French cavalry had already charged and failed 16 times. What was once an organized army of Europe's greatest nobles had become a broken mass of exhausted men and dying horses. In the final desperate wave, Philip VI himself joined the charge. He rode forward with his personal guard, determined to turn the tide by his presence alone. But it was useless. Arrows tore through his men. His horse was struck and went down, throwing him to the ground. An arrow pierced his jaw, leaving him wounded and bleeding. His guards had to drag him off the field by force to save his life. Even the King of France could not break the English line. Somewhere in the mud, the oriflamme, the sacred battle banner of France said to guarantee divine victory, was abandoned. For generations, this banner had been a symbol of royal power and God's favor. That day, it lay trampled and stained with blood. The sight shocked everyone who saw it. For the French, it was more than a lost flag. It was a sign that their entire worldview was collapsing. Night fell over the battlefield, but the fighting did not stop completely. The English army, exhausted but disciplined, stayed in position on the hill. They did not celebrate. They did not relax. They waited. Any French soldier who moved in the darkness was finished off on the spot. Archers who had run out of arrows picked up mallets, stakes, and knives. They moved through the field, striking down wounded knights who groaned in the mud. There would be no ransom for most of these nobles. There would be no mercy. This was not a knightly tournament. It was cold, efficient killing. Dawn revealed the full scale of the disaster. When the mist lifted, the battlefield was carpeted with bodies. Horses, knights, and mercenaries lay tangled together. The cream of French nobility was gone. Chroniclers list the dead with shock. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, the Count of Blois, the Count of Auxerre, and many more. In total, around 1,500 nobles had been killed, including 11 princes and countless knights. The English losses were astonishingly small. Only around 40 men were killed, including just 2 knights. 1 English knight for every 750 French nobles. The numbers were so extreme that many chroniclers at the time refused to believe them. Some even claimed that God had intervened on England's side because nothing else could explain it. The French army that had arrived with banners flying and trumpets blaring now lay dead in the mud. Philip VI limped away wounded. His nobles were slaughtered. The sacred banner was lost, and the English, standing on their hill, had barely moved from their positions. They had turned discipline, terrain, and technology into a perfect killing machine. The morning after Crécy was not just a victory, it was a revelation. It proved that centuries of noble warfare could be overturned in a single night. The French had thrown the flower of their aristocracy into the grinder, and the grinder had won. What remained on the field was a silent, gruesome monument to arrogance in the end of an era. The consequences of Crécy reached far beyond the muddy fields of northern France. For 5 centuries, heavily armored cavalry had dominated European warfare. The knight on horseback was seen as the ultimate symbol of power, nobility, and divine favor. Battles were decided by charges, and victory belonged to those with the richest armor, the finest horses, and the most noble blood. Crécy shattered that belief in a single night. The longbow, a simple piece of yew wood in the hands of peasants, proved more decisive than the most expensive armor money could buy. The shock to the nobility was immense. For generations, their status had been tied to their military power. A noble was superior not only by birth, but by the ability to command the battlefield. Crécy exposed that myth completely. A Welsh peasant, forced to practice archery every Sunday after church, could kill a duke, a count, or even a prince just as easily as another knight could. Blood no longer guaranteed survival. Chivalric codes and noble traditions offered no protection against a storm of arrows. The French had no choice but to adapt. The loss of so many nobles created a power vacuum that disrupted their entire social and military structure. They began to hire more crossbowmen, build their own corps of archers, and, most humiliating of all, copy English tactics of fighting on foot. They learned to dig in, prepare defenses, and fight with discipline rather than relying on glorious charges. But change was slow. Just 10 years later, at Poitiers, they made the same mistakes again, charging uphill into English archers and losing another king along with thousands more nobles. It took almost a century for the French to fully modernize their army and abandon the old ways. Ironically, the dominance of the longbow itself didn't last forever. It required years of practice and physical strength to master. You couldn't train an archer overnight. When gunpowder weapons arrived in Europe, everything changed again. A musket could be fired by anyone with minimal training. Slowly, gunfire replaced arrows, and the weapon that had ended the age of knights was itself pushed aside by new technology. Crécy was more than a victory. It was the death of a worldview. It proved that war was no longer the exclusive domain of nobles. Technology, tactics, and preparation could overturn centuries of tradition. It marked the beginning of a military revolution that would reshape Europe for centuries to come. And when we return to that muddy hill, we can picture the final image clearly. French knights, the proud elite of Europe, charging again and again into a storm of arrows, trampling their own allies, desperate for glory but finding only death. Around them, crows feasted on noble flesh until they grew so fat they could barely fly. In one night, English archers ended 5 centuries of knightly supremacy. Nobility couldn't stop arrows. Courage couldn't beat mathematics. The medieval world died in the mud,